Welcome to Instead. It is good to be here together to this time of sharing stories, hearing one another's stories, deepening our connections with one another. This morning, it's pure delight to me to be able to introduce our two storytellers. And I think I'll introduce them one at a time. The first one this morning is Rod Sinks. Rod is the father of Christina Sinks, who you saw on the screen if you were in worship a little while ago. We're calling this the Sinks Family Full Employment Morning. And Rod will tell you more about himself, but I will tell you that I am someone who has been watching Rod's action in our community for a long time, and I am regularly moved by what he does, the commitment with which he does it, the way he lives his faith and convictions in the world. And I'm just looking forward to you having an opportunity to hear his story. Welcome, Rod.
Thank you very much, Kathy. Well, it's good to be famous because of your daughter, right? It is. We're very proud of both our children, Mark and Christina. They're both finding their ways in the world. So I grew up in a suburb of Minneapolis. I loved skiing and sailing and paddling the boundary waters in a canoe, which I still do. I'll tell you much of my story very quickly so we can get on to a main point I'd like to make. I became an elder in the Presbyterian Church while I was in high school. I went off to Sweden as an exchange student. I studied liberal arts at Grinnell College in Iowa, decided to become an engineer, came out to Stanford to do that. I sang with the Stanford Mendicants, and if you were here for Bill Hare's talk, you will have heard about this group. Niall Norton was one of the founders, who was the music director here. And they were, after my graduation, Bill Hare started to record them to develop the a cappella sound that he became famous for. I pursued a tech career here for 30 years in Silicon Valley. I worked at one established company and then two startups over 30 years, so just 3 companies. And those startups were modestly successful. After many, many years of work, it wasn't a get-rich-quick scheme, I'll tell you. During a 12-week sabbatical for my first job at Rome Corporation in Santa Clara, I decided to go to Spain, where I met a wonderful woman named Britta from Germany at a Spanish language school. She was in the advanced class. I was in the more basic class. But she got a fellowship in San Francisco in banking. We dated, and we married 2 years after that. We talked about our 2 children, of which we're very proud. They're each finding their way in the world now. For most of my adult life, I was heads down, focused on my career. I was working long hours. I was traveling quite a lot, managing teams here and there. But I did become a Y youth leader in the community, and then I became a scoutmaster with Troop 37 that meets in Lacey in downtown Los Altos. And although I casually read local news on occasion when I had time, I really only had a foggy idea what was happening in the Bay Area and circles outside my own. For me, that changed a decade ago. I entered local government, focused initially on environmental issues, the Lehigh Quarry and cement plant in particular. But over time, I became much more aware of problems with the status quo in Silicon Valley, and I adopted a broader agenda. So I'd like to share the story of some of the things I learned during my time in public service in the hopes of motivating you to also become more engaged. Most of the statistics I'll cite come from joint venture Silicon Valley, who really have the best pulse on the health of the valley in its many dimensions. And they publish an annual report called the Silicon Valley Index, which you can download in PDF form for free. Let's start with housing. Our kids, now in their mid-20s, mid-late 20s, like many of their peers who grew up here, have lived with us on and off since they graduated from college. And really, it's no surprise. In the last decade, housing prices in the Bay Area have nearly tripled. You may be able to buy a home if you have 2 big tech incomes. Most everyone else has either owned for years or pays big rent or suffers a long commute. Pre-pandemic, 8% of Silicon Valley's workforce faced a daily round-trip commute of at least 3 hours. And many worked multiple jobs. And yet many cities here, and certainly including my own, Cupertino, refuse to entitle significant new housing. They've spent the last few years downzoning to prevent housing instead of upzoning to encourage it. And they refuse to negotiate to get a win-win that includes benefits for the community. At a State of the City address in my city not long ago, our mayor joked that Cupertino should build a wall to keep out folks from other cities. Now, the joke backfired because the actions of his council majority and the opinions they expressed in opposing housing rang all too true. He had in fact previously expressed the view that it was really not our problem if people working in our city had to commute every day from Stockton. Housing and transportation are clearly related, so let's talk about transportation. Public transportation here in the Bay Area is ineffective for most people. It's run by 27 separate agencies that have little coordination. So when Apple and Google and Facebook wanted to build new offices in cities like mine, with all the traffic, we just said, well, you need to figure out how to minimize single occupancy car trips. And given the state of our ineffective transit system, they responded, as you might have figured, they started moving their employees to work with fleets of private buses, unlike their employees in most areas of the world, where they simply take public transit. And there's a reinforcement of the public transportation system by those in such companies. But most everyone else in the Bay Area, our teachers, our service workers, fight their way through traffic by car. So now we have a transportation solution here in Silicon Valley, something we've created that works for big tech employees, although it's expensive for their employers, but it doesn't work for anybody else. Now, by comparison, if we were to look a little bit north to Portland, Oregon, they have half our population density, but they have a public transportation system with 3 times the ridership per capita of our VTA that operates in this county. Now, Portland has unified governance of its transit systems, and they have a payroll tax. It's paid by employers that funds it. A business community here in the Bay Area has fought to prevent that here. Biking is often a good alternative for some, and we've had success opening new dedicated bike lanes in cities like mine, but those who live adjacent to those lanes often organize to oppose them, despite the many benefits, including improved safety that they bring. There's a lot of fear in change. I get it. A new poll shows that 56% of Bay Area residents are likely to leave in the next few years. 77% of them cite housing costs as a major factor. Silicon Valley's income equality has grown twice as quickly as the rest of the state and the nation over the past 10 years, and 53% of Silicon Valley households hold less than 2% of its wealth. Now you may say, as many do, what's wrong with that? Supply and demand for housing and jobs may cause some people to move elsewhere, but it will make room for others who will continue to make Silicon Valley a prosperous place, an economic engine for our country and the world. We're at full employment now. In aggregate, our local economy has bounced back from the pandemic. Tech is healthy with record market caps in the last year. We have a surge of new venture capital. And our meritocracy rewards the brightest and most ambitious of us. It's how our system has always worked, right? Most of us who own our own homes have watched our equity increase as prices have increased. And after all, we worked hard for it, didn't we? We got on the housing escalator decades ago, or years ago, and good for us. But I'd ask you to think about this more deeply. If the only people who can afford to live here are families with 2 tech incomes, who exactly is it who will teach our children and our grandchildren? Who will staff our senior homes, our restaurants, and our public agencies? Do we have any responsibility to increase the housing supply so that people in these jobs that are essential to our welfare and economy do not have to commute in from Stockton every day? There are lots of people in the Bay Area who did not get on that housing escalator with us. A key reason is that they, or their parents, or their grandparents, faced housing discrimination based on the color of their skin. Redlining was policy sanctioned by the federal government in the 1930s, and its effects are still with us today. The generational wealth our parents left us and that we'll leave to our kids through housing appreciation are largely unavailable to families who faced that discrimination, and they were left out of the American dream. They came to live in neighborhoods burdened by pollution from refineries, factories, shipyards, warehouses, and freeways. In the Bay Area today, you can predict lifespan, which varies dramatically based on your zip code. Now, you may say, gosh, this is an old story, 1930s. Things must have equalized over time thanks to, say, landmark civil rights legislation that we remember in the 1960s. Or, at least locally, thanks to so many Bay Area politicians with that liberal agenda working diligently on the problem. The latest data from joint venture suggests otherwise. Our neighborhoods in the Bay Area are even more segregated now than they were in 1980. In 2022, given the same educational attainment, Black residents in Silicon Valley earn only half of what white residents earn. Latinos only 36%. Some 44% of children in Silicon Valley live in homes that are not self-sufficient. Of 44 metros in the US, in 2020, our country had the largest population of unsheltered homeless. Now, that's all hard to hear, I get it, but there are some encouraging signs. The public seems to be growing more sympathetic to these challenges. Now, 92% of Bay Area residents see the cost of housing as very or extremely serious. 89% see homelessness as very or extremely serious. Still, when it comes to a housing project in their own backyards, many folks will come out in opposition. Hours of testimony at local city council meetings, rather than speak out in support. The state of California is enacting new laws to enable more housing, overriding recalcitrant cities like mine. And transit advocates are pushing for better integration between those 27 separate agencies. At the Bay Area Air District, whose board I chaired in 2020, we've doubled down to reduce pollution in communities which have borne the biggest health burdens from our refineries and ports. So that's points of good news. But if we step back now and consider the bigger picture, the unprecedented concentration of wealth and disparity that continues here and across the country, I think it's fair to ask whether the fabric of our society that binds us all together is beginning to stretch and fray in places such that at some point it'll rip asunder. Now, perhaps that sounds alarmist to you. After all, we're the oldest, most successful democracy of the history of humankind, and we're governed by the rule of law, right? Larry Diamond, a political scientist at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, is an expert in measuring the health of democracies around the world. He says that our democracy is sick. He says it was in decline well before January 6th of last year, and we have many of the indicators that are precursors to autocracy. The failure of democracy in modern times in places like Hungary and Turkey didn't occur in a coup. It rather, more normally, democracies these days fail in small steps. As wealth inequality is high and grows higher, as free press erodes, and people no longer listen and can widely share the truth. This is enabled by an apathetic public that takes democracy for granted. New York Times columnist David Brooks reminds us that democracies are quite a recent form of government. Not common in human history, autocracy is in fact the common state. So perhaps you, as I once did, figured those problems were someone else's responsibility, and that you and I had no power or influence to change the outcome. But I'd like to suggest that there are many ways for you to also take responsibility. Democracy is not a spectator sport. Real citizenship in these times requires more than casually voting, serving on a jury, reciting the Pledge of Allegiance, standing to hear the national anthem at a ball game, and paying taxes. You can study the Silicon Valley Index I mentioned, for example, and read books such as Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law to understand the history and legacy of redlining. You can pay close attention to what your city council is doing to encourage or discourage housing development and address transportation in your community. You can lend your voice at public meetings for any city, county, or local agency, thanks to California's open meeting laws. You can meet with your state representatives. You can asking how they propose to address our challenges, and supporting their attempts to do so with your letters and phone calls. And you can support candidates for local office, hosting coffees, walking and knocking on doors, offering financial contributions, or you, and I mean you, can run for office yourself. Don't be intimidated by that thought. You can start with just one step, then take the next and the next. Be in community with people from whom you can learn, and others who, with your prompting and encouragement, will follow in your footsteps. There is frankly nothing I have found as satisfying as making positive change in this way. And I challenge you to be a change maker too. And here's my epilogue as I conclude. I termed out of office, elected office at the end of 2020, which then meant I was no longer eligible to participate in all these regional bodies that I'd been a part of. I had helped, among other things, found Silicon Valley Clean Energy, which is our local community choice energy agency, in 2015. And as I went through my years in public service, I learned a lot about our role in climate change and mitigation. We created good programs to put us on a path to reducing our carbon emissions. But we frankly struggled to design effective programs with good uptake that would help low-income folks and nonprofits to receive the real benefits of electrification. In July 2021, a little less than a year ago, I became president of the Cupertino Rotary Club. And I saw a need that we could fill as a nonprofit, helping other nonprofits add things like rooftop solar and storage and heat pump water heaters to electrify their facilities. We've now done this for low-income housing owned by West Valley Community Services in Cupertino, Pace in Sunnyvale, and others. And we've most recently worked on LAUMC's Mountain View campus. We've done a big project to put 60 panels up on that roof, bringing in 5 Rotary clubs and a lot of foundation funding. It was so much fun. It really was fun. And everybody who worked on that project was really satisfied. So it was a win-win for everyone. There's a video of that project, a 4-minute video that you'll find either on LinkedIn or Facebook if you look me up. Our Rotary Club is also working as the catalyst for 2 low-income housing projects in Cupertino, one on land owned by the city along Mary Avenue, another on land on North De Anza Boulevard where the former Outback Steakhouse site sits. I convinced the county about a year ago to buy that 1.5-acre site. It, for low-income housing, is already zoned to host 68 homes. So we're hoping to see both of those projects to fruition. So that's how I've been looking forward and enjoying my time in the last decade. It's been a privilege to talk to you today. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. Rod has given us so much to think about. I want to encourage you not to engage the issues, right? Because we could do that for many hours or perhaps days or weeks. But if you have a question or a comment, a bit of a conversation you want to have with Rod about his story in particular, this would be a good time. Just raise your hand and I'll ask the question. I'm holding the microphone so that I can repeat the question for our live streaming participants as well. Is there something you'd like to ask or say? Karen, yes. Yeah, Rod, the question is this faith work for you to do this work?
You know, I grew up in a church. The values that my parents and that church brought to me informed what I'm doing. I am inspired by people like Leslie Carmichael and Mike Hacker, you know, that have worked so hard to create Hope's Corner. If you go volunteer there, you hear the stories of people who simply ran out of luck. Something happened in their family, they lost their housing, and they're people just like us, right? So I think this church and this faith community have done a great deal to inform and help me understand, right? What could happen to any of us at any time. And I'm deeply moved and inspired by what people like them have done. Or Carol DeMonte, starting Art Changes Us. Think about those kids that struggle in school, right? They've been bombarded by social media and bullied, and they may find a real outlet and to find their place in the world, not through some academic path, but through art. Or at least they become part of a community that saves them effectively from what can be a really difficult thing to do here, grow up, right?
That sounds like compassion to me. Yes, Chuck.
You described very well, I think, regional issues that we all face, but the natural tendency is for the individual governmental units to address it parochially, strictly with their own interests in mind. Is there any movement afoot to start to address these regional issues on a regional basis?
Chuck asks whether Rod's experience is very local, and whether there's a broader regional movement to deal with some of these same issues.
Well, I think if we understand we have issues, that's a starting point. If we look to other places, I cited Portland as an example of how at least transportation is moving much better. I think there are. Russ Hancock of Joint Venture was the speaker at my Rotary Club this week. And he said, when asked if he was emperor of the Bay Area, what would he do? What one thing would he do? He said this: I would have a regional government. We have 104 different cities and counties and jurisdictions in the 9-county Bay Area. And at least for transportation, some of these things, we have a lot of parochialism, and we simply don't have time or energy anymore to continue to fight. We've got to get together and see the broader issues in a broader context. That's my view.
Yes, Raymond.
Rod, you have remarkable children, and they inspire us. I'm wondering what young people are around that inspire you.
Raymond asks about people the age of Rod's children and how inspirational their lives are to us. And specifically, Rod, what young people do you see who inspire your work?
I will tell you, we have young people in a Rotary program called Interact that are making a difference in our communities. I will tell you that I've often talked about addressing climate and other things at local colleges and high schools. We have a lot of brilliant kids, and they have hearts and minds that are going to change the world. And at some point, right, my job is to help them, simply to help mentor them, to figure out how we can seed the next generation, because they're going to fix some of these things. I'm confident of it. I have real hope, and we have to put them on a firm foundation to help them get there sooner in some cases.
I can't help but take this moment for a little public service announcement from LAUMC specifically about young people. We just received in the mail this last week a check from the Lilly Endowment for $1.5 million for a project that we are just beginning, that it's the next step in the changemaker work that we do here at Los Altos United Methodist Church. And this project specifically comes from a proposal that we made to find young people in our community in Silicon Valley who think of themselves as activists, who are about making impact, making a difference in our community, and helping them to see churches as allies in that work. Churches tend to have people and space and money and all kinds of things that are about the same work in the world. And what this project is designed to do is to put not just our church, but churches generally in Silicon Valley and young people who are activists in the world together to do more for this flourishing of our communities that we hope for. So, other questions? Yes, Les. That's great. Les mentions a leadership academy in Mountain View that runs in Spanish and in Mandarin. It's great to know. Thank you, Les. Margie. Margie asks about your personal ambitions. I think we're all ready to run your campaign here.
Yeah, I have no plans to run for anything. I am advising my congressperson, Ro Khanna. One of the things I'm doing is trying to take community choice energy national with the help of the Department of Energy and so forth. So we've had a good meeting with Ro and his staff to try to move that agenda. The truth is, we need to move much faster than we are. I attended an executive education program at Harvard a couple years ago, and it was focused on climate. And there were leaders at mid-level of governments from around the world, and at one point they said, raise your hand if you have a story to share that might inspire the rest. I talked about community choice energy formation and how yesterday at Earth Day, we celebrated 5 years of Silicon Valley Clean Energy's operation, providing a carbon-free product in our base rate at a lower cost than PG&E. And how do you do that against a large monopoly? So a woman from Rocky Mountain Power said, we operate in a number of states where the monopoly utility, they won't let us. The state of Wyoming won't let us shut down the coal plant. It costs us a lot of money to keep it going. We would be better off investing in renewables. But we make profit based on our costs. And if our costs are higher, it works for us. But it's surely not working for the residents and businesses we serve. But that's the reality of politics. If you brought this change thing to that community, she sounded like she was ready to jump ship and go work for a competitor, right? The competition that would bring on the change faster. She said that would be a wonderful thing, because then everybody would see that their electricity rates could go down, frankly, right? So I'm working on that and working through the Rotary Club to try to fill in holes for nonprofits for the programs that government can't cover.
There's so much more to say, and we are out of time, but I'm going to do a little improvisation here. I'm looking at my colleagues on the Deepening Faith team. We have not talked about this, but I want to add something to our instead process, which is a blessing on Rod. And so I want to invite you, in that ancient symbol of blessing, to raise your hand toward Rod. And we bless you, Rod, in your work and in your being, in the ways you are the presence of God in this community. We are grateful to be among you and to be with you, to love you and support you in all you do. May God bless you. Amen. Thank you, Rod. And there's more. It's really a complete delight for me to introduce to you my friend Winston Sherard, who you know, at least from a distance, as he stands up here and reads scripture in his resonant, deep voice, and greets you at the door as an usher, and we welcome you to this Instead platform. Winston, come and tell us your story.
Thank you. And good morning. And I want you to know that I miss you. And I really mean that. I miss the church. I miss being here. I miss greeting you. I miss reading to you. But we're going to get started again. I am going to get started again and not let this pandemic and being married to a nurse, which we'll talk about later, stop me from being here. I'd first like to
thank Pastor Kathy for inviting me to be a part of the Instead program, to tell my story, to tell most of you and some of you that don't know me a little bit more about me. I must admit that when she asked me to do this, I was a little reticent about doing it, because I do consider myself not a recluse, but certainly a private person who is, well, the pandemic did me well because I have no problems in being alone. But I will tell you that none of us are ever alone. And why? Because your Creator gave you a comforter. And if you read Scripture, which we'll talk about later, you will understand that that comforter is with you always, especially in your quiet moments where you are trying to quiet your mind so that you can either get some rest, you can start thinking about the day's events in your life, you can start thinking about whether it's good times or tragedy or things that are going on around you. Know that you're never alone. So, for me, my life started in Richland County, Columbia, South Carolina, where I was born. And I was born to a mother who, being the oldest now of 4, I have 2 brothers and a sister, and they live in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. We'll talk about that a little bit. And I want you to know this, that my mother is the root of me, especially from a spiritual standpoint, especially when I look out at an audience like you and I see who you are, and I've known most of you, and I've talked, laughed. The root of all of that that cometh from me comes from my mom. The reason? My mother came from a family of 10, 6, or I should say 7 girls and 3 boys, and came from a farming family in a little place called Ivor, South Carolina, which is right on the Savannah River, which separates South Carolina and Georgia. And today, we still own the property that's on the South Carolina side. It's not large, but it's about 100 acres. And it used to be more than that. The big thing that I want you to take away from me today are the 3 things that are my foundation in living in this world and in living in this America. Not only as a black man, but as a man, period. Number 1, my spirituality. Number 2, family. Family means a lot to me, and I'll talk about that. And number 3, education. My spirituality started in Columbia, South Carolina. And it started in a church. And at 3 years of age, my mom was on the choir. And I was sitting down in front with one of her friends, watching me. And as the choir was ending, the pastor ran up and hugged her. And I broke away and I ran up and kicked the pastor on the knee. My mom was in shock. And that started my spirituality. So from that, my mom calmed me and said, "It's okay, Winston." And Mrs. Hope, my mom's friend, said, "Winston, it's okay. He's not." My mom had come in from Louisiana where she was working to have me in Columbia, and we were staying with my aunt, her older sister. And that was a great experience for me to begin to get the taste of family, to begin to understand the Sherard household, to begin to understand my heritage, which goes back not only on the white side, which is on my grandmother's side, because my grandmother could sit here with you today and you would think that she was white. But also on the Cherokee side, because if you know history and if you don't, the Cherokee Nation is in the Carolinas, Georgia. And the land that we live on today, that was left to us, was basically Cherokee land. So I won't go into the real, because I'm sure some of you are familiar with the Trail of Tears. And the Trail of Tears Oklahoma is not the place that the Cherokee Nation was founded. Just to clean that up a little bit. It's in the Carolinas. And I have a picture, and anytime you want to stop and ask me, it's on my phone, of my great-great-grandmother who was full-blooded Cherokee, 16 years old, given to my great-great-grandfather, whose name was Winston. And that name, Winston, was passed to my grandfather, and that's who I am today. So the spiritual implications that came into the Sherard household, we were never slaves. And so we're in a time and place in this country where we are understanding and beginning to understand even more about slavery. And you can understand it even more, too, if you go out and get a book called 1619 Project and read it and understand it. But we were, as old man Billy Sherard, who was white, didn't believe in slavery. He came over from Ireland with the root of our family, Jesse Sherard, and we took the Sherard name. He made sure that Jesse and his offsprings all had land, which, of course, like I said, we still have, on the Savannah River. He made sure that they were married to, as they say, the finest ladies that lived in the different plantations around. And consequently from that grew the Sherard clan. My mom, along with her 6 sisters, all went to college. All have degrees beyond BA, BS, master's degrees, etc. My 3 uncles went into the service. The little gray-haired aunts that I came up under wouldn't allow anything other than to go and get your education, Winston. And they didn't fool around with it. Hey, Florence, what is he doing in school today? My mom's name. It was almost like it had to happen. So when you think about 7 black women coming off of a farm in South Carolina, going away to college, and let me not leave out the fact that they graduated, at least 4 of them graduated from Benedict College, which is an HBCU in Columbia, South Carolina, where my uncle was the president. It made it a little easy for them to get into Benedict College at that time. And the others, I think 2 or 3 of mine, South Carolina State, etc. But as I said, they all had that we're going to get our education mode, and we're going to make sure that our children and our children's children, our children's children's children get an education. After leaving Columbia, because around the age of 5, my mom met a man. She was doing volunteer work at the Red Cross, and he had been in World War II, and he had been in the theater, and he had lost a kidney. And so my mom, being who she was, she attended to guys that were in the hospital, and that kind of brought her to him. And he fell in love not only with my mom, but he fell in love with her lemon meringue pie. Boy. So there I was now, and there we were, my mom and I, moving to Winston-Salem, North Carolina, where everything took on a different meaning in terms not only of my spirituality, but also in terms of my education and in terms of who I am as family. And in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, even today, it is a very progressive city. Most people can tell you about Charlotte, North Carolina, and most people can tell you about the Raleigh-Durham Research Triangle area. But they don't talk too much about Winston-Salem, which is home to Wake Forest University, and the Moravians. And they forget that Winston-Salem is that little gem of a city that is right at the foothills of the Blue Ridge Smoky Mountains. And a very progressive, and always has been a very progressive city for blacks, where black people had their own buses and cabs and schools and funeral homes and churches and even hospital, library. And because of all of that, we didn't really get exposed to the white side of town, if you will, until integration, which nobody really wanted, because why? We have our own. Why? Of course, it was a time of progression, moving forward, which in the end has turned out, I think, to be pretty good. But I went to Atkins High School, and Atkins High School at that point was the second next to Dunbar High School, which is in Washington, D.C., named after Paul Laurence Dunbar, top black high school in this country. And it really turned out a number of professional people, not only in athletics, but also in the arts, also in government. If you can remember Just thinking about back in when Bill Clinton was the president and his Secretary of the Army was Togo D. West Jr. Well, Togo and I went to Atkins High School together. Or if you talk about, and there are others, talk about athletics, naturally I was drawn to, if you will, as I began to get a little bigger. Because at birth I was just 5 pounds, and so my mom's standard joke was, I could have taken him home in a shoebox. Wow. Well, I don't think I can fit in a shoebox now. But the game of football I enjoyed because I felt like this is a sport that I can hit somebody and not get arrested. And trust me, I did the best I could not to get arrested. And from there, I had a full scholarship to Virginia Union University in Richmond, Virginia, where HBC, and began to play, and didn't think anything about my play other than doing my job, and ended up going to the Boston, now New England Patriots football team. I was a little surprised about that myself when the player personnel for the Patriots called my coach and said, we've seen him on film and we'd like to have him in camp. I thought I was going to the Dallas Cowboys, believe it or not. That's why I'm not a Cowboy fan today. Not really. But it's kind of hard, and as I tell people, when some team gives you an opportunity, you have a tendency to stay with that team in terms of following them and how they progress. So to the Patriots I went, and I spent 2 years, and I got hurt. And came home and wondered what would I do, and one of my friends said, well, Winston, you know, you can have an interview with Eastman Kodak in Rochester, New York. And, you know, the human resource guy, he is in the, he was in the Pittsburgh Steelers, oh, no, I'm sorry, Pirates organization, baseball. And you two will hit it off. And sure enough, we did. And the next thing you know, I'm flying my family to Rochester, New York to work for Eastman Kodak as a sales rep. And from there, transferred to Chicago for my first territory. And from there, after experiencing all the cold weather and the wind coming off the lake and my sons catching colds, we flew out here, and I said, wow, sun sure is shining out here in California. Maybe we ought to think about getting transferred out here. And I ended up talking to my district sales manager, and we ended up making a decision that I would transfer in divisions, and I would leave consumer division and go into color print and processing. And I don't know how many of you remember that Kodak, Eastman Kodak, had a color print and processing plant lab right up on Page Mill Road. That's where I worked. And that's where I was the guy when it came to going out in sales, but I was the only black guy, which brought about problems, political problems at that time. I've never been a politician. I've never been a political person. What you see is what you get, and what you get is truth. You know, kind of back to that spirituality of truth and trying to live it. It can sometimes be hard, because my mother would tell me, Winston, I believe you. I'm not worried about you lying to me, but sometimes you have a you should probably use tact and diplomacy. She was right. But sometimes it's overbearing and it just spills out. So truth became my mantra. I also thought, even after going to Virginia Union, that I would be a minister. But I forgot what my mother said. She said, you know, the ministers and the great ones that I've seen, and I was at the foot of one of, I thought, the greatest ministers, the Reverend Dr. Kelly O.P. Goodwin at Mount Zion Baptist Church in Winston-Salem, of course, and one of the oldest churches there, one of the oldest black churches. And in fact, it's 130 years old, and they've never had but 5 ministers. It's a little different here, huh? Seems like, but I won't go into that because I love our pastor too much. So I've seen the changes here, though, because I've been a member here for 30 plus years, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But anyway, my mom said, well, you know, I believe that ministers are called by God to give you the word, his word. And she just left it at that. Well, by my sophomore year, I didn't feel I was getting called. So I ended up majoring in sociology, graduating with a degree, going to play professional football, going to Eastman Kodak, and then getting transferred here. And that kind of wraps up the first few minutes. And I then came here, and over the years, ended up meeting my now wife. And the thing that struck me mostly about her was she said, I would like to marry a man that would go to church with me and sit in church with me. Hey, I'm your guy. As much as I was afraid, I had to raise my hand. And so here we've been here at LAUMC for, as I said, I call it 30,000 years, but a long time, but not as long as many of you. And I'm enjoying it. We were married in this church. My mom said it all when she said, you know, Winston, I think you'll do well in this church. It has a feel about it. Wow. For my mom to come in and say something like that, that pretty much sold me on LAUMC. I don't care what Lisa said. My mom had already said it. So here I am in front of you, talking to you. I could talk to you forever about things, but here are things that I really want you to take away from this story. As you talk to your children, as you talk to your grandchildren and your great-grands, give them that foundation, number one, spiritual. And when I say give them that foundation, I don't mean I mean encourage them to read the Word of God. Because God has asked us what? Learn of me. And so not only read the Bible, but also read things that tell you, concordance, et cetera, biblical encyclopedias, et cetera. Number two, and I think most of you are good family people, and make that family bond and that family time tight, so that your children and your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren and future generations are never afraid to step forward to talk to you about anything. That's important. And especially in today's misinformation and disinformation and conspiracy theories, etc., that you can sit down and talk to them and tell them the truth as you see it and as what you know. My daughter often asks, because she was coming here, she's been here, She sang on the choir here. Dad, well, what if my truth is not your truth? Then I say, show me evidence. That's all. Just show me evidence. Again, I encourage you to do that. Education is important. Rod just gave us education. He just told us about housing. He just told us about climate change, especially housing. And I understand it because, as I said to Rod when I first met him, I'm a reader. I'm an avid golfer. I can't hit anybody anymore but a little white golf ball. And I believe in education. And I believe in family time and family bonding. So, you have somewhat of an idea about who I am. And I won't bore you anymore, but I want you to know I love you because I've been asked to love you. And the older I get, the more I understand the meaning of love. Now, we could talk about 1 Corinthians, 13th chapter, but I choose to end with Hebrews 11, the faith chapter. Now, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not yet seen. That's the very first in that chapter, verse. And I think if you have enough faith in you, and especially these days, you can do anything you want to do. But you must have faith. Thank you.
I had to take this microphone because you're doing my job. Thank you, Winston. Thank you for your story. You have blessed us. And would it be all right if we bless you? I would invite you to raise your hand as we bless Winston, and we ask God's blessing on you, Winston, on your whole journey of spirituality and education and family that has brought you here to this place, on your past and your present and your future. May God's grace rest on you richly, and know that you are a blessing to this community. We love you. Amen. Amen. Thank you all. It has been good to be together. Have a good rest of your Sunday.